In this portion of the lecture, we'll focus on Lady Wisdom's speech that spans verses 22 to 33. Having reached the city gates, that is, at the end of verse 21, Lady Wisdom delivers a speech, and this speech is delivered in two parts. In the first part, she addresses prospective pupils directly. Notice, for example, in verse 24, the statement, "I called out, but you refused." This is direct address, speaking to the pupils. In the second portion, she will refer to those same pupils, but will refer to them obliquely, such as in verse 28. Then they, notice the third person, on their part will call out to me. That shift from second person address to third person reference accounts for our dividing of Lady Wisdom's speech into block A that spans 22 to 27, that's the second person direct address portion, and block B spanning verses 28 to 33, that's the third person oblique portion. What's particularly interesting about the two parts of Lady Wisdom's speech is that the second portion revisits several concepts that were introduced in the first, but does so in inverted order, pivoting on verse 27. Those parts may be entitled then, Block A, Lady Wisdom appeals to potential pupils, ending in verse 27, and Block B, Lady Wisdom reflects on victims of folly, 28 to 33. Let's focus then on verses 22 through the first half of 23. Wisdom's plea, inviting three candidates. When first addressing potential pupils, Lady Wisdom begins by naming three types of people and lamenting their penchants. The opening query, "How long?" implies that she has challenged these characters for some time prior, much as a prophet who long indicts wayward Jerusalem. Consider Jeremiah 4:13. The penchants typify in turn each of the three characters, mapping out a vector of increasing resistance toward wisdom. The first, that is the naive, hold the greatest potential for reform. While they love naivete, they hold much more promise than fools, who comprise the third group. For fools hate knowledge, indicating a resolute impenetrability as far as Lady Wisdom's counsel is concerned. Positioned between the naive and fools, scoffers find pleasure in treating others with derision. The scoffer is not so clueless as the naive, on the one hand, nor, on the other hand, is he so closed as the fool. Both naive and fool will reappear in the palistrophically balancing unit, that is, B1, wisdom's conclusion, that we find in verses 32 and 33. When the naive and fool reappear at that point, they will be accompanied by a strategic new third character who displaces the scoffer that was part of the original trio. After lamenting their native inclinations, Lady Wisdom then urgently invites, "May you turn to my reproof," verse 23a. Not one to sugarcoat her antidotes, she flatly states that they must abandon their current course and be willing to swallow that bitter pill of reproof. And now we come to Unit 2A2, which I've entitled Wisdom's Proposition, a Choice Extended. This governs verse 23, parts B and C. Here we learn what benefits await the pupils if they would but consent. A tone of optimistic generosity, followed by suspense, permeates Lady Wisdom's overture. The use of an imperative form, a command form known as cohortative, this occurs in the expressions "would that I might pour," "would that I might explain." These cohortatives join with a adjussive form, another command form, in verse 23a, namely, may you turn. These three together portray this archetypal sage as if she is eagerly leaning forward, barely able to refrain from forcing on her beneficiary this gift she is so eager to bestow. In the intent to give her spirit, we should detect an almost reckless determination to bankrupt herself, putting her very best at the disposal of interested students. She is no parsimonious preacher with arrogant aloofness, relinquishing occasional favors to her adoring followers. Rather, she has pursued them hopefully, and having found them, does not withhold even her best. Her actual gift will consist of words. Such is the shape her spirit would take. Given that the term spirit may also be rendered wind, the sage may be indicating that the candidates eventually will encounter wind of one sort or another, either now in the form of wisdom's gracious instruction, or later as a ferocious storm. Now we come to Unit 2A3, Wisdom's Reason for Her Response. An offer refused. This spans verses 24 and 5. Here, Lady Wisdom's statements may seem logically inverted. First, we hear an explanation. Quote, because I called, because I stretched out. And that appears right here in verses 24 and 5. It is only after the explanation that we learn what sort of behavior on Lady Wisdom's part would require such an explanation. And that's in the expression, I will laugh at your disaster, in verse 26. Due to palistrophic inversion of the corresponding later units, explanation will follow behavior, not precede it. So it is in verse 28 we find a response given, and then after that in 29 and 30 we find the explanation for that response. So the sequence of response and explanation is inverted in the palistrophically balanced lobes. It is worth noting the escalation of wisdom's overtures that we find here, moving from a vocal invitation in verse 24a, I called out, and then an arm extended, I stretched out my hand in verse 24, part B. Similarly, the rejections displayed by the prospects escalate in disrespect. First, they acknowledge but decline her offer. Here we learn this from the expression, you refused, in 24a. And then in 24b, they show not so much interest as even to acknowledge wisdom's extended hand, shown in the expression, no one paid attention. Not a shred of advice offered generously by Lady Wisdom garners so much as a glance from these prospective pupils. 25a says, you ignored. Let alone earning a glimmer of receptivity toward reprimand. 25b says, you did not accept my reproof. On the basis of such rejection, on account of these reasons, is it any wonder that wisdom will respond as she does in verse 26? So we are brought to verse 26, Unit 2A3, entitled Wisdom's Response, Ridicule. Such rejection that we've just seen explains why it is that wisdom responds as she does, abandoning earlier overtures, which by now have proved futile. No longer will she waste any time trying to change their minds, but instead will herself mirror their rejection. Verse 26a, likewise for my part I will, and so on. The disinterest which the prospective pupils have sown will mature into the retribution that they will reap. Wisdom's hope and concern now grow cool, displaced by laughter, 25a, which then swells to derision, 25b, as she watches the recalcitrant flounder in disaster. And now we come to Unit 2A4, Disaster, verse 27. 3 times from verse 26b and on into 27, we encounter the verb comes, 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 virtually drumming the inevitable onset of this devastating storm. The expression in Hebrew is bevo. Self-confidence now flees, terrified before the shredding whirlwind. Word choice that's offered here in the translation before you of the term anxiety and the term affliction, this pair attempts to reflect the alliteration that's actually at work in the Hebrew in these two terms, tzara v'tzukah. Evidently forming a fixed pair, this climactic crescendo dispenses with any softening similes. Note, the writer does not say that these are like a storm or like a whirlwind. The simile like is omitted. As a result, it produces the rapid impact of an assailant's ungloved double punch. That wraps up the first portion of Lady Wisdom's speech, Block 2A, spanning 22 to 27. And now we move to Block 2B, which is verses 28 to 33. Lady Wisdom reflects on victims of folly. Their doom sealed. In the second portion of her speech, Lady Wisdom ceases talking to the candidates, but rather withdrawing from them, talks about them in the third person. Yet there must be someone who still remains within earshot of her words. If not the 3 prospective pupils, then who? Either she is speaking to herself, or, more likely, it is we, the reader, to whom she now quietly turns her attention. The structure of this second half revisits in reverse order each topic encountered already in the first portion, that is, 22 through 26, omitting repetition of the central and stormy 5th step, that is, verse 27. That 5th step serves as a pivot between the first and second portions. As with the palistrophic core that we saw in Proverbs 1, 14 and 15, here again the center marks a focal point of intensity. In order to show more clearly the connection between blocks 2A and 2B, they have been assigned the same Arabic numerals. Due to the reversal of topic sequence in Block B, the numbers will appear in reverse order, starting with Unit 2B4, verse 28, and continuing forward to Unit 2B1, verses 32 and 33. Let's look at the first unit of Block 2B, that is verse 28, which for palistrophic correlation is enumerated 4, Unit 2B4, verse 28. Wisdom's response, remoteness. The ferocious storm finally will succeed where Lady Wisdom failed, succeeding in persuading those victims that they really do need Lady Wisdom's help. But now it is not wisdom who will issue a call to them, such as we saw back in verses 21 and 24, but now it is they, on their part, who will commence calling out to her, verse 28. Unfortunately for them, it now will be too late. She is now deaf to their cries. Though they search for her frantically, their search will be in vain, second half of verse 28. Thus, Lady Wisdom responds to their plight by withdrawing, becoming more remote. In the palistrophically parallel section, Lady Wisdom gives a similarly negative response to the plight of those who have rejected her call. And now we're directing our attention to Unit 2A4, which is verse 26, entitled Wisdom's Response, Ridicule. That brings us to Unit 2B3, verses 29 and 30, which is entitled Wisdom's Reason for Her Response, an Offer Refused. Lest we suppose that Wisdom's rejection stems from her own attitude of callous caprice, she states her reason clearly, as she did back in Unit 2A3, that is verses 24 and 5. At the core lies the fool's fundamental disregard for the training that Lady Wisdom offers, 25 and 29. The fault is theirs, not hers. As indicated in the prologue of the book, by opting against reverence for the Lord, they have chosen not to know even the first thing about wisdom, Proverbs 1:7. Our current quatrain, verses 29 and 30, signals an explanation with the term since, the Hebrew expression tachat ki, in verse 29a. The palistrophically linked quatrain also opens with an expression signaling an explanation, and there in English it's rendered because, in Hebrew, ya'an, 24a. The author further cements palistrophic correlation of units 2A3 and 2B3 by recycling 4 terms found in each: except, my counsel, all, and my reproof. Now let's turn our attention to Unit 2B2 in verse 31, Wisdom's Principle, a Choice Made. In Unit 2A2, Lady Wisdom extended a choice, an opportunity available to the fools. Verse 23, parts B and C read, Look, would that I might pour my spirit upon you. Would that I might explain my teachings to you. But they decided to reject her offer, choosing to follow their own way instead. Now, in Unit 2B2, she returns to the topic of a choice, showing what happens once a choice has been made. This is verse 31. Just as fruit follows as an outgrowth of a prior planting, so the way chosen by the fools will yield fruit. And just as earlier she wished that they would, quote, turn to my reproof, that's the jussive form that we found in 23a, so now she wishes on them the consequence naturally issuing from their choice, namely, that they may be filled with that fruit. Here again we encounter the principle of retribution, that feature so central in the sage's worldview. Unit 2B1, Wisdom's Conclusion, assessing 3 candidates, verses 32 and 33. Lady Wisdom closes the poem by returning to the theme of disaster, summarizing what will befall various characters. In her opening plea, she reached out to 3 characters. That was Unit 2A1, verses 22 to 23a. 2 of those characters, as we've already noted, persist here at the close, namely the naive and fools. Like thugs who would die by their own bloody hands, back in Proverbs 1:18 and 19, these characters too sadly prove to be self-destructive fellows. Even the term waywardness, which is the means by which naive are slain in verse 32a, this is tinged with a sense of missed opportunity, an opportunity which appeared earlier in the palistrophically linked portion. For when Lady Wisdom first urged them to break free of folly, she exhorted them using the term turn, that is in Hebrew shuv, verse 23a. From this same root is derived the noun waywardness, in Hebrew meshuvah, which is a turning away from a correct path. And that is the term that we find in verse 32a. They would not turn their way toward Lady Wisdom in 23, and by virtue of that refusal, they sealed their waywardness in 32. Complacency emerges as the error of the second group, that is, fools. This is in contrast to the waywardness of the naive. Complacency involves heedless ease bred of excessive self-confidence. Slovenly self-sufficient, the fool here shuns advice from another. Waywardness and complacency will return to haunt, to harm, and ultimately destroy these first two characters. The third character in Unit 2b1 is remarkable for his novelty within this entire poem, namely, one who listens. Nor does this one listen indiscriminately. His teacher is none other than Lady Wisdom. Only a receptivity such as this will obtain reliable security. Notice verse 33. The one who listens to me shall dwell securely and will remain undisturbed by dreadful terror. With this final phrase, the poem assures that the same evil terror that will wreck the fools, in verses 26 and 7, will be powerless to disturb the calm enjoyed by wisdom's attentive disciple, 33b. Let's summarize what we've seen concerning the palistrophe operating in these two blocks of section 2. Arrangement as a palistrophe affords the poet of this particular composition two advantages. First, with the exception of the storm in Unit 2a5, that is verse 27, each step of the argument can be treated twice. The storm in verse 27 was a single verse pivot point. Second, only a palistrophe allows a thunderous apex of tension to appear at the poem's center point, the storm in verse 27, while reserving for the actual conclusion yet another emphasis. In this poem, that second emphasis involved the introduction of the model disciple, the one who listens, which actually comprises the greater point within the sage's overall presentation. The sage is not so much interested in surprising people with the high register of storm, but rather with moving his audience to emulate the hearer, and that is where the poem ends. In contrast, had this poem been arranged in non-palistrophic fashion, we would have introduced the hearer in B1 right after the storm of verse 27, not where it's more powerfully released at the closing point of the composition in verse 33. Only the inverting palistrophic structure allows us to circle back to three characters, surprising the reader by changing out the third of those three, bringing in a positive model to emulate, that is, one who listens to wisdom. Let's recap what we've seen in this Lady Wisdom's appeal. After outlining the book's purpose, and after setting forth two foundational wisdom teachings, that was Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, the sage then seeks to capture the reader's attention by presenting two competing high-stakes appeals. The first is the appeal of wealth. While alluring, it is dangerously misleading. That poem governed Proverbs 1, 10 through 19. Danger threatens in the second appeal as well, but only if the potential pupil resists the generous overtures of Lady Wisdom. And now we are referring to the poem just finished, Proverbs 1:20-33. The only safe option remains to accept wisdom's offer and thereby to enroll as a hearer, a disciple. In the next poem, the pupil will be challenged to move beyond merely passive acceptance of wisdom, instead becoming an eager wisdom pursuer.